I'm Jack. My mission is to kill chaos.
Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox, and recently Ready Player One released a very interesting video, kinda guide to the elements of randomness in War of the Visions, while also making the point generally that there was a lot more randomness lately, and that these elements of randomness were also increasing. The predictability of the game, which is something that is particularly important for content creators like himself and me, who more often look at the data and try to come up with character evaluations based on some sort of empirical idea of how this character will do in general situations. So for me, chaos, especially within this game, breaks down into two things that are actually pretty similar, but I think should be discussed separately. The actual randomness side of this is actually one of the more common ways it's being used right now. And even if you crunch all of the complexity about a fight, throwing in randomness just itself makes it harder to predict. And it also means that there could be matches where you would normally win easily, because a particularly clutch thing happened, and also fights where you lose easily because it didn't happen at all, or because it didn't even get a chance to occur for some other reason. So for this part of the video, I want to focus on things that are truly random. I would also like to point out that a lot of characters that I feel lean more into the specific style of randomness to win matches that they might not be able to win otherwise are called curveballs, or sometimes even wild cards, because I think either of those descriptions is pretty illustrative of the idea of the way that units like Helena the Black Rose, Vivi, or Sodley Christia fit into the meta. As a contemporary example of randomness in media, we can look at the book and subsequently series Three Body Problem, which studies an alien universe that has three suns all orbiting around each other. This creates an unpredictable effect that has drastic consequences for the alien civilization living on a planet orbiting this trisolar system. And despite their and our best efforts to model and predict what the system will do so that they can know how to prepare and survive, ultimately, this proves to be so random as to be unpredictable. Or at least, you can say largely what a thing might, or what a system might do within the next 1,000 years. But it becomes nearly impossible to say what it might do tomorrow or the next week. I think this actually indicates a solid intersection of randomness and complexity. I've already given you an example of complexity, and since this video builds on the last, I think it's fair game to say that this is a really good illustrative point because of this intersection of high levels of randomness and high levels of complexity. In addition to there just being so many factors of complexity that accounting for them all becomes impossible. But also, just like crunching the numbers on calculating what they're going to do faster than they actually do it itself becomes impossible. Without insanely advanced predictive software, you will always be behind the ball on predicting where any of the three suns is going to be, because you can't predict where one sun is in a vacuum. They're all three interacting with each other, so you have to be able to predict where they all are simultaneously. Also, I think that this is an interesting parallel to PvP and War of the Visions because it has its own kind of three-body problem. In that, with the variety of different characters and how they can interact with each other now, there's a certain level of unpredictability in some cases about how they might move around in different matches, or even on the same map and how this affects their buff order. This might be its own kind of three-body problem. For example, with the exclusion of passive hate, which can affect the movements of my characters or yours from the other side of the map from the beginning of the match, it's usually easier to predict with a certain level of exactness exactly how units will move to buff each other before other units can come into range of them. Because if you start out in the same way with the same conditions every time, you should see things play out about the same way. Also, there aren't a lot of elements of randomness in buffing. Sometimes buffs are linked to status effects, and this can mean that on some occasions these status effects won't land if your faith is lower than a certain level, but practically speaking, this rarely factors into matches. It's on the point when the two teams begin to clash that everyone starts moving in their own way, as each of them begin to evaluate the situation based on dynamic terms. To evaluate the complexity of the situation is already difficult enough. But in this video, I'm going to demonstrate how true randomness adds an extra level of difficulty in predicting outcomes, at least when we're talking about an individual match. A good way of thinking about this would be to think of randomness like flipping a coin. The coin has two faces, so all things being equal, there's a 50-50 chance it will land on either face. I can't tell you which one is going to land on any particular throw of the coin, although I can guess fairly well. I can also lose half of those guesses pretty reliably. But if you flip a coin 1,000 times, or even more, 1,000,000 times, I can predict that maybe 40 to 60% of those are going to be heads. And I think that number approaches 50% the larger of a data set you end up with. Whereas complexity is more like meteorology and trying to predict the path and interactions that a hurricane is going to have. More specifically, predicting what something is going to do once teams start clashing in War of the Visions is a little bit like trying to predict the direction and force of a specific piece of wind at a specific point in time and space within a hurricane. It's easy to, it's not easy, it requires really serious predictive software, but it's relatively easy for us now to predict the overall path of a hurricane, although sometimes outside factors accumulate in such a way that we're wrong. But predicting it on this level becomes impossible. When randomness and complexity interact in the way that we're ultimately going to be talking about here, the metaphor becomes a lot more like predicting the flip of a coin in a hurricane. Well, not really, because it's still going to be 50-50, isn't it? But that was a terrible metaphor. Moving on. There's a double-edged sword with randomness, by the way. And that is that in large enough volume, it is predictable. We've predicted the chances of things happening. In fact, with a lot of the elements of randomness we see in War of the Visions, we have that percentage built into the equation. Now, how that interacts with complexity is especially difficult when you take into example counters. Counters, for instance, have a specific chance of happening, so you know that percentage. But also, they only trigger sometimes against certain damage types or certain types of attacks, or at certain ranges. So there's elements beyond just that percentage that also affect whether or not it's going to happen in the real world practically. But if we remove all of those elements of complexity, we look at some of the least complex counters. A good example would be Reflex. Reflex is the king of pissing people off over RNG in this game. Ever since, definitely before Cloud, Reflex has been here since the very beginning. 15% chance of dodging either magical or physical damage. That's basically everything in the game, although not exclusively everything in the game, oddly enough. That happens 15% of the time, all the time, because it happens at all ranges against basically everything that comes at it. Which means that 15% is relatively overpowered compared to a lot of the other things that I just alluded to. So if a character consistently takes 4 or 5 hits to actually take down, then you're having maybe a 60% chance of reflexing one of those hits, surviving a little bit longer, and doing a thing that in other timelines you never would have done, which can completely change the outcome of the game. But the thing that really pisses people off is that some subset of those times, you're going to reflex the first 3 hits and just waltz through this like a fucking ballerina. And it is maximally frustrating when this happens. Even though percentages being what they are, it often is counterbalanced by the fact that many times that team won't get a single dodge in through Reflex for entire fights. And for characters like Cloud, who are getting increasingly squishy, and I mean original Cloud with Reflex, the counter abilities are another good example of this. A lot of people have since the beginning of the game hated on any character that was given the Reflex ability due to that scenario that I mentioned earlier, where they got 3 dodges in a row and they lost a match that they otherwise feel that they should have won 100% of the time. But the thing about 100% of the time is that reflex happens 15% of the time, 100% of the time. In Arena, I think this makes things more interesting. I think it means you really have to play into the complexity and be able to counter at least some of that in some way. I also think it makes for more interesting outcomes of fight. One of the best examples of complexity and randomness is with status effects. On the other hand, talking about statuses, let's say you have Soddly. Soddly is like one of the original units that I really listed as a serious curveball in this game, because his LB gives him one shot in a fight to charm someone. And if you can charm the right unit, or really any unit of a person's team, then you really mess with them. Suddenly, especially if this happens relatively early on, it's a 4v2 fight, at least for a little while. And with the AI telling their team not to attack its allies, and with your enemy AI telling you not to attack a charmed unit because it's kind of on your team, it's kind of unlikely that they get hit. But in the way that Will discusses with sleep and confusion, it is dispellable simply by being hit. So a certain amount of times you can charm a unit and then they get hit by something and it completely counteracts the effect without really doing anything extra. And even though you landed that charm, it doesn't do anything. That's complexity. But at the same time, like, let's say that you always line up and use that skill. Let's remove all the other complex things. Let's say that's going to happen every fight. That no one's going to outrange you in one-hit Soddly, any of that stuff. You're always going to charm or try to charm one person. I don't remember exactly what the percentage chance is, but let's say you have a 50% chance. Even disregarding faith and how this would be even less likely to happen against physical units. Let's say that happens basically 50% of the time. And in fights that it does happen, you win, but you're a little bit outmatched in basically all of the other fights, so you lose. Essentially, Soddly would be adding into the game a functionally rudimentary coin flip system to where he can just flip a coin and see if you win. Now, this disregards an incredible amount of complexity, which actually counteracts how fucking annoying that would be if it actually worked like that. And in a game like FFBE, which doesn't have the complexity of a real-time tactics system, it would kind of work like that potentially. So the complexity actually saves us from that being absolutely devastating, and instead makes it something that is devastating sometimes and completely turns around the tempo of the game. I mean, you go from 3v3 to 4v2. Things like that, I think, make randomness interesting, and sometimes its interaction with complexity can really be a good thing as well. Because again, it would be really annoying if you almost always got charmed by Soddly. I mean, this is kind of how it feels going up against characters that get these effects on AoEs, like Curse for Sephiroth, or Black Rose Helena and her sleep ability. Moving back to what Will said, there's a lot of randomness within the reincarnation system as well. You get your bonus stats, and this is a big part of your stats to be done randomly. This is why I always evaluate characters based on their maximum stats, and this is why it's sometimes hard to model what your team is going to do with my team, because my stats could be very different from yours if we're both at 40 reincarnations. Maybe for a character like Ashen Mon, I have a bunch of my HP and attack already, so he's just a big brawly dude. Meanwhile, you've maxed out like luck and magic. I'm probably going to win that because you've kind of got his junk stats. Though at the same time, if you maxed out his luck, maybe if you're running an evasion team, that's even better for you because now we can't hit your mon. This is randomness and complexity. But then there's also certain stats themselves which have this complex interaction with the game, like dexterity or luck, either one really. And it's really hard to say exactly how much that mattered. I mean, did that 1 or 2% extra evasion cause you to dodge? did that little extra dexterity cause you to get a critical hit? That critical hit factor is just another base way that most of these games add in a certain extra amount of randomness as well. Now, there's a lot of people who specifically zone in on randomness as a thing that they want to avoid in game design, and yet game designers almost always include some element of randomness. Why is that? Well, in my humble opinion, it's because the people complaining are wrong, not the game designers. But the people who think that randomness is a thing that needs to be avoided at all costs miss the point, because randomness, when executed correctly, can create incredibly dynamic matches in a really fun way. That being said, with so much of the power creep coming in the reincarnation system and the stats assignment being fully random, I mean, it's maybe the worst intersection of these two things, especially when you combine it with the UI issue that I don't even have any indication of how reincarnated you are, because I also can't predict how that will affect your stats. So this can be a pretty big deal if we're talking about the way that RNG affects your matchups and your ability to win. And then finally, going back to things that Ready Player Will was talking about in his video, there's chain resistance, which is actually complexity more than it is anything, but I missed it in the last video. It was on the last slide here for other mechanics. So this affects some teams more than others. For some teams, we'll be able to chain more, and we'll chain more in certain scenarios. It all really comes down to the individual speed/affinity of each individual character on the field. Now that affinity has been uniformly maxed, the complexity here actually comes with whether or not you're using that toggle to turn it off, which has strategic benefits and drawbacks itself. Even the very concept of affinity, while it was simplified, is still a matter of complexity on the field that is actually even more polar than it was before, because it was possible for you to have, say, like 3 of 5 affinity and be in the middle. Now that's no longer possible. They're either a 1 or a 0. I mean, they're either a 5 or a 0. It's a binary choice at this point. And like all of that, in addition to their buff order and how they come into combat, who has hate on the opposing team, how they bunch coming into the other team, all of that is going to depend on how easily they're able to chain with each other, which also is going to come down not only to their physical location on the map, but also their location in time through turn order. The smallest of changes in my experience, changing a TMR to one with less agility or more agility, can completely alter this in certain scenarios on a really fundamental level that is maximally hard to predict and always really has been. So the idea of a team's ability to maximally chain is already a little bit up in the air in some cases. Some teams are really, really good at doing it consistently because they all have chaining moves and you're intentionally putting them all in the same element or attack type or whatever. So this is just really complex to know, because like if you never get chained on in a fight, it did nothing. But also, if you do get chained on in a fight, because that's pushing damage up and the other thing's pushing it down, and how much of it you have is pushing it down, but also there's 6 other types of defense that are somehow, and also 6 other types of penetration, etc. How much does the chain attack resistance actually do? That's what I want to know! And because of the combination of both randomness and complexity, as I've talked about throughout this video, who the hell knows is ultimately the answer, and while you could be unsettled by that, I think it's kind of fun. I think it's kind of interesting. I think it increases our blind spots, and as our blind spots are widened, it also allows more unique plays, more tiny niches to pop up. You can learn a specific way of playing a specific strategy, even using suboptimal units, that is consistently a winner. You can take a bad unit, flip it, and make a big buck in Arena. There's so many things here to praise with complexity, and even with randomness, and even with the way that they interact with each other. While at the same time, it's not great for me, a person who's trying to tell you how to use your team and predict how it will perform for you and allow me to troubleshoot without ever actually meeting you. It's a difficult enough job in this game already, and a lot of these factors are making it harder. But at the same time, I think it's why it's more important to do a data-focused and data-driven analysis of this game rather than just going by vibes. Like, until I see the data for a character, I don't really want to say that much about them. I may like or dislike elements of their kit. I may think the flavor is cool. I may think that they have utility. I may be excited about who I think they can go up against. I may already be theory crafting. But are they good or not? I think at this point always remains to be seen. Anyways, that's how I learned to stop worrying and embrace the complexity. Thank you guys for listening to this full series. I'm Jackie Fox, and you can find me all over the internet if you click the link in the description. But also remember that the free-to-play option for YouTube is to like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment. Tell me what you think of the video, what you think about the things that we discussed in it. Tell me some stories. I want to hear the craziest Reflex story that you can possibly think of in, like, multiple characters reflexing each other. Multiple characters reflexing the same skill at the same time. All the just craziest, what's the odds stories in the comments. Also, in that link, you can also find my main channel where I discuss the world around us. That also has an associated podcast if you just want to listen to me on your ride in the car. Also, I sell books and take donations, so if you want to check out those things, if you're into fantasy fiction, which I don't know, you might be if you're paying attention to the story of this game, or if you're into more realistic fiction, I also write that as well. Links to those books can be found in the description. But in addition to that, if you just want to throw some money to support the channel, help me buy groceries, or help me with my next set of pulls, then be sure to do that. And I think if you do it on coffee specifically, you can send me a little note with it and be like, hey, this $10 is for pulling, Fox. $10 is for pulling, and I may even film the pulls for you if you do that. I don't know. There's all sorts of ways that we could do this, but it all begins by you clicking that link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one.